Okay, we are now live. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Federico from Research and Growth International, and I'm happy to welcome you to this webinar about our latest policy brief on a Green New Deal Beyond Growth. And yes, we're very happy to announce the publication of this new policy brief by Riccardo Mastini, who is here with us today. A Green New Deal Beyond Growth is a framework for policies that reimagine the European political economy beyond the pursuit of GDP growth. We know that a system dependent on continuous economic growth is doomed, especially in a planet of finite resources, and there is no scientific evidence for decoupling between environmental impacts and economic growth. So given this evidence, our representatives at the EU need to look at the science, they need to be responsible, and they need to implement policies that deliver well-being to all within the ecological limits and without the necessity of continuous economic growth. And in this sense, the policy framework developed by Riccardo Mastini, a Green New Deal Beyond Growth, is one of the first of its kind, and we will soon hear from him about it. In general, we recommend you to download it from our webpage, to engage with it critically, to let us know your thoughts about it, both today during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. We have a Mentimeter here. You can see a QR code, but also in other spaces by sending us an email or through social network. And yeah, so today we're co-hosting this webinar with the European Environmental Bureau, a leading network of environmental organizations in Europe. We are very grateful for the work that they have been putting in organizing this event, and for all the work they've done in the last years for alternative approaches to policymaking and to environmental policymaking. And today's event is organized as follows. So first we have Emilie Tricarico from the European Environmental Bureau, who will give an overview of the current deregulation wave and attacks against NGOs in Europe. And then we will hear from Riccardo, the author of the policy brief, who will present the Green New Deal Beyond Growth and its policy proposals. And then we will move to a panel discussion. We have here 3 experts that work on the policies that are mentioned in the policy brief. I will present these 3 experts when we move into the panel discussion later. Before I give you the floor, Emilie, I will briefly introduce Research and Degrowth. We are an organization, a think tank based in Barcelona that promotes research, education, and advocacy of degrowth and post-growth economic approaches. We organize a variety of educational programs, such as 2 masters at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, 1 online and 1 in person, different online courses, and a yearly summer school. And we are also trying to have an impact on policymakers by promoting the organization of events and conferences at the EU level, at the national level, like the Beyond Growth conference in 2023 at the EU Parliament, and the one in the National Spanish Congress in the last September. And within this advocacy strategy, we are also publishing these policy briefs, documents that summarize key degrowth policy proposals or non-reformist reforms, as we call them, that want to show how to move from the current growthist capitalist system to a post-growth society. You can find these policy briefs on our website, and the one that we are discussing today. Okay, so let's start now. I will give the floor to Emilie. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you, Federico, for the introduction, and thanks for hosting the webinar together with us today. So yeah, I just wanted to give a very short overview of the current high-level EU political context we find ourselves in, because I think it's important to set the scene for the discussion today. So just a quick recap, you may all know that we had elections of the EU Parliament in June 2024, and this resulted in a big shift to the right. Now far-right members account for almost a third of MEPs in the Parliament. And the new EU Commission in place, which is still led by Ursula von der Leyen, who pioneered the Green Deal, clearly tanked to the right as well. We can see now that the priorities of the commissions have departed massively from Green Deal days. There's a complete absence of climate issues. In fact, the Green Deal has been replaced by a clean industrial deal. So we see a big narrative shift there. The main priorities of European, which is the cost of a living crisis and inflation, is not even addressed in the priorities of the Commission. So from our point of view, within our work at the EEB and in civil society in Brussels, we can see some big trends that are at play under this new EU political cycle. And this is a reflection as well of obviously the wider political economic context we find ourselves in. And I believe that the main ones that are at play are, you mentioned I was going to talk about deregulation, but also authoritarianism and militarization. And with regards to deregulation, it's an unprecedented wave of deregulatory packages that are an attempt to roll back the EU Green Deal agenda and other key environmental and social safeguards in order to strengthen capital's interest. These are presented as simplification packages by the EU Commission. But in fact, they will double down the neoliberal toolbook by cutting red tape for big companies at the expense of public interest for EU citizens. And this is done under the guise of competitiveness. So to revamp European competitiveness, we need to deregulate key pieces of legislation. We have so far seen put on the table 8 so-called omnibus packages. So this means that this is a sort of process that allows the EU to reopen legislation files. These are under the field, various different fields, including corporate sustainable reporting and due diligence, chemical, defense, food safety and agriculture, public investment, digital rights, and the latest one, the environmental omnibus, was released last week. But actually, the EU watchdog, the EU ombudsman, recently slammed the Commission for all these omnibus packages because it found that it was committing maladministration, which is quite a grave offense for the EU, as it was using undemocratic and fast-tracking procedures to dismantle health and environmental safeguards. So to be seen what's going to happen on that front, on the deregulatory wave. But just to say that obviously the Green Deal package that was a sort of big success of the EU in the previous mandate is now completely being dismantled from left and right, and mostly obviously from the right. And on top of that, we see also a huge authoritarianism trend, which with the rise of the far right, which is obviously attacking the rights of migrants and minorities the most. Last week, the EU adopted a new agreement which will facilitate the transfer of migrants to third countries, so like harsher rules for migrants to the EU, but also general attacks on civil liberties, the rule of law, and an increase of greater shrinking of civic space. Environmental NGOs like us at the EB have also been at the forefront of a so-called what we call the witch hunt by the liberals in the parliament, the EPP and the far right, which were accusing us to receive EU money to do lobbying on behalf of the EU Commission. And so this ongoing manufactured scandal was used to discredit civil society's legitimate right to do basically advocacy in the EU on behalf of citizens across Europe. On top of that, we also see across civil society that we're facing huge funding crunch. This is obviously led, directed by the sort of shift from US philanthropy as well, the removal, shrinking of US aid. So it's affecting health organization, the UN, as well as environmental organization. So this is adding to this authoritarianism shift that we are seeing in Europe. And lastly, and I will finish briefly because obviously we want to give the floor to the presenters. We are seeing a militarization shift, which is the sort of new direction that the EU is taking for its economy. It's moving into a war preparedness economy. It's really preparing to go to war because it's using this argument that we need to rearm Europe to reboost growth and competitiveness. And to do so, it's putting like 800 billion euros package, which is also includes regulatory measures for the environment that will that will boost defense. So to remove all the safeguards that are protecting those like the current investment measures we have. And it will also exempt those investment rules from the current fiscal rules that all other priorities need to follow. But defense will be exempted from it. So we see the political direction there of this shift. And so as we see, obviously, like this huge dismantling of the Green Deal, and repositioning of the EU towards sort of a neoliberalism on steroids with the sort of far-right, anti-democratic, but also militarization trend. We should really ask ourselves as progressive, what should we do in this new context? How can we articulate a bold, coherent narrative that can challenge these ongoing political trends while rallying popular support for a new vision for the economy? And I hope we can answer at least partly this today in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilie. I think your presentation set up the stage for the overall, for the discussion later. And it's important to start by knowing what's the current context, no? And so now I will ask Riccardo to present the content of the brief. Riccardo Mastini developed the Green New Deal Beyond Growth framework during his PhD program at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Correct me if I'm wrong, under the supervision of professors Jason Nickel and Giorgio Scallis, and has published academic articles about it. And he's now a researcher at the Polytechnic University of Milan, focusing on environmental policy making. and he also provides consultancy to United Nations agencies and NGOs.
Thank you, Federico, for the introduction, and thank you, Emily, for this reality check. I'm very pleased to be with you today and having the opportunity of presenting this policy brief, which was originally conceived as a call to arms to candidates to the latest European Parliament elections. And as Emily very clearly pointed out, this call to arms has went unneeded, and that's why we are in the situation we are now. And what I would like to do in the 15 minutes of time that has been allocated for my presentation is to walk you through, let's say, the core arguments of the brief. So first of all, I will briefly situate where Europe is today. So in the following the footsteps of what Emily has presented, and why essentially the current policy framework, in my opinion, is not fit for purpose. Secondly, I will explain why continuing to treat economic growth as both a goal and a funding mechanism for climate policy is deeply problematic. And then the third part of my presentation, where I will spend most of the time, is focusing on presenting some policy proposals that I think could articulate a more progressive climate and environmental policies in the EU. So let's start with where we are at today. So Europe is facing not one but three interlinked crises. The first is an economic and social crisis. Inequality in Europe is at historically high levels. We know that the top 10% own roughly half of all wealth. And at the same time, in work poverty is increasing, and more than 1 in 5 Europeans are at risk of poverty or social exclusion. So this is not an accident. It's the result of deliberate policy choices, in particular, decades of austerity that have constrained public funding, weakened public services, and left large parts of the population economically and insecure. The second crisis is an ecological crisis. Europe is already experiencing the effects of ecological breakdown, from record-breaking heat waves to droughts, floods, biodiversity collapse. We know that only a small fraction of species and habitats protected under EU law are currently in good condition. And of course, if these trends continue, parts of Europe could become extremely difficult to inhabit within our lifetimes. The third crisis is a crisis of democracy. Trust in political institutions is low, both at national and EU level. Many people feel that decisions are taken far away from their lives by technocratic institutions that are more responsive to corporate lobbying than to citizens' needs. And this democratic erosion is closely linked both to inequality and ecological breakdown. So I would say that these three crises are not separate, but rather they reinforce each other. The richest Europeans have vastly larger carbon footprints than the rest of the population. Then inequality drives environmental destruction, and the concentration of wealth translates into the concentration of political power, which in turn slows down meaningful climate action. Against this backdrop, the European Commission launched the European Green Deal that has been recently rechristened as the Clean Industrial Deal. And the central argument that I make in the policy brief is that these proposals by the European Commission are structurally incapable of delivering a just and rapid ecological transformation. And the reason, in my opinion, is quite simple. These policies treat economic growth as both an objective and a condition for success. So the Commission explicitly presents these Green Deals as Europe's new growth strategy, and its funding model relies on reshuffling existing budgets, constraining public spending through fiscal rules, and crowding in private finance through public guarantees. And this creates a situation where social justice, climate action, and fiscal responsibility are essentially pitted against each other rather than being, let's say, three manifestations of the same political approach. Public investment is kept artificially scarce. Member states are expected to rely on private capital, despite the well-documented failures of public-private partnerships. And the risks of public investments are essentially socialized, where profits are privatized. And crucially, the entire project depends on the assumption that we can continue growing GDP while rapidly reducing emissions. And this brings me to the second part of my talk, meaning why growth is the wrong compass to articulate these policies. The idea of green growth, meaning that we can continue to grow the economy while reducing environmental impact, has become almost a matter of faith in EU policymaking. But the scientific evidence increasingly shows that this faith is misplaced. GDP growth is tightly linked to energy and material use. Even when emissions declines domestically, much of the environmental burden is simply outsourced through imports. So when we account for consumption-based emission and material footprints, the picture looks far less optimistic. The IPCC latest report itself has stated that observed decoupling between GDP growth and emissions is insufficient and far too slow. In practice, pursuing growth makes decarbonization harder because every additional unit of economic activity adds pressure on energy systems, land use, and ecosystems. And climate change is, of course, only one dimension of the ecological crisis. Biodiversity loss, habitat destruction, resource depletion, these are driven primarily by the scale of economic activity, not just by the carbon intensity of production. We know that a high energy, high throughput economy powered by renewables would still require vast amount of land, minerals, and infrastructure. And there is, of course, also a global justice dimension because Europe's consumption levels depend on resources that are extracted from the global south. So without reducing overall demand in the EU, the green transition risks becoming a new phase of extractivism and ecological colonialism. And finally, there is a microeconomic problem, meaning that many high-income economies, including most EU member states, face a structural stagnation because of aging populations, high inequality, and weak demand. Growth is unlikely to happen even if we were to single-mindedly pursue it. So the core proposal of the policy brief that I authored is that Europe needs a Green New Deal that does not depend on growth, neither as an objective nor as a funding mechanism. And there are several policies, several approaches that I think we can use in order to structure policies that don't depend on growth. So the first pillar that I present is a progressive wealth taxation. So as I previously said, environmental responsibility in Europe is extremely unevenly distributed. The richest 1% have carbon footprints that are many orders of magnitude larger than those of the poorest half of the population. So there is simply no plausible pathway for high wealth individuals to reduce their environmental impact to sustainable levels without a substantial reduction in their wealth. So rather than just looking at technological substitution, we need to think how we actually decrease the purchasing power of the wealthy. At the same time, people on low incomes have often higher emission than they would like because poverty restricts a choice. They simply don't have the money to afford house retrofitting or buying an electric car. And so they are forced into inefficient housing, long commutes, and low quality goods. And this is why blunt price-based climate policies such as carbon taxation can be socially explosive if they are not embedded in a broader welfare framework. So a Green New Deal beyond growth must therefore start from addressing wealth inequality head-on. So progressive wealth taxes are not only a matter of fairness, but they are also an environmental necessity, so to decrease the excessive purchasing power of the very rich, and at the same time redistribute economic opportunities to the rest of the population to invest in, let's say, ecological, let's say, purchasing choices. So reducing excess consumption at the top, curbing political power concentration, and at the same time create the fiscal space to expand the public services. And so For instance, in the brief, I present the adoption of high marginal wealth taxes on extreme fortunes that are not radical in historical terms. If we look back at the 50s and 60s, we see that we used to have much higher marginal wealth taxation. And these steep forms of taxation are all the more needed now to address, of course, the ecological and environmental issues that we have been discussing. The second pillar that I present in the policy brief is a job guarantee, which is essentially a permanent public program that ensures that anyone who wants to work can access job at a decent living wage. It is a voluntary scheme and it should exist alongside the traditional social protection systems. The idea is quite simple, but at the same time powerful. Just as central banks act as lenders of last resort to stabilize financial markets, governments can act as employers of last resort to stabilize labor markets. So in a Green New Deal beyond growth, guaranteed jobs should focus on socially and ecological necessary activities that are systematically underprovided by the market, such as care work, community services, ecosystem restoration, energy retrofitting, local food systems, essentially all those activities that tend to be ignored by the private labor market because they don't ensure high returns. So a job guarantee would have several advantages. So first of all, it would eliminate involuntary unemployment. It would strengthen workers' bargaining power across the economy by setting a wage and conditions floor, since workers in the private sectors can always walk out of their job and take a job, take essentially work provided through a job guarantee. And at the same time, this policy would allow society to allocate labor towards use value, so meaning towards those activities that are actually needed by society rather than towards profit maximization. Importantly, the job guarantee would allow us also to rethink productivity, because in a growth-obsessed economy, higher productivity is always the goal. But from an ecological perspective, productivity often means a higher throughput of energy and materials. So we should redirect work away from high return, high productive jobs and towards low return but socially desirable activities. So a job guarantee can deliberately support labor-intensive activities such as care work and environmental restoration. The third policy that I present in the brief is what we could call a form of public abundance, essentially reverting the trend that has seen in Europe a widespread privatization and enclosure of essential services in the last few decades. So we should decommodify housing, transport, healthcare, education, and energy, because the enclosure and the privatization of these services has in a way created a form of artificial scarcity, forcing people to earn and spend more just to meet basic needs. So basically, we see GDP growth because money changes hands. People have to purchase these services that used to be for free as private commodities nowadays. So we see GDP growth because of that, but at the same time, we see well-being stagnating, if not decreasing, because of this enclosure and artificial scarcity of public goods. So we should flip this logic, and instead of private access and public scarcity, we should aim for private sufficiency and public luxury. So concretely, this means expanding universal basic services. So healthcare and education should be fully funded, publicly provided, and decommodified. At the same time, housing must be treated as a social good, not as a financial asset. So we should implement policies that include, for example, strict limits on the number of properties that individuals can own, a large-scale expansion of public housing, and strong public rental options that discipline, so to speak, private rents. Looking at public transportation, a policy of public luxury would essentially make public transport free or very cheap and massively expanded where it is inadequate. High-quality public transit is one of the most effective ways to reduce emissions while at the same time improving people's lives. And then when we look, for example, at food systems, we should reorganize them around food justice and ecological regeneration principles. And when we look at the provisioning of energy and water, we should run them as public utilities, for example, with a two-tier system, meaning a free basic allowance sufficient to meet essential needs, and then a very steep progressive pricing for additional consumption to discourage excessive use of these resources. Jumping on to the final pillar, since my time is running out, which I think is a core aspect of what should be discussed, it is essential financing. So a common question that is posed to us articulating for a post-growth approach to climate policies, how can we afford all this without growth? Well, the answer is that governments do not need growth in order to mobilize resources. What they need is real productive capacity, meaning labor, skills, materials, technology, and Europe already has these resources in abundance. Public spending does not need to be funded by prior private income. Rather, governments can create money when they spend. And this has been repeatedly demonstrated from quantitative easing after the 2008 financial crisis to the massive fiscal responses to COVID-19. So the real constraint is not finding the money, since governments can always increase the money output, but rather is how do we balance inflation? And inflation, we know that can be managed through taxation, regulation, targeted reduction in excessive private consumption at the top. So essentially, we should print money in order to finance the public services. And if the economy hits up, if we see that inflation is ticking up, well, we should reduce the amount of money in the economy, essentially by increasing the taxation of the wealthy. So reinforcing some of the policies that I was presented earlier. And in order to articulate this form, let's say, of public funding, of course, the European Central Bank would play a central role by supporting public investment and job guarantees through monetary financing, while member states would use progressive taxation to manage demand and reduce inequality. So essentially, we need to reframe the debate because the question is no longer whether we can afford a just and green transition, but rather whether we can afford not to pursue one. And I would conclude by saying that I think the political discourse that is needed to advance this kind of demands is that a Green New Deal beyond growth, so a transition towards a post-growth economy, is not about sacrifice or austerity, but rather it is about redirecting Europe's immense productive capacity towards what actually matters, meaning meeting human needs, restoring ecosystems, and strengthening democracy. I think that this is what voters, what citizens really want. So it's a matter, I think, for NGOs, researchers to articulate this kind of clear proposals, clear messaging, and put pressure on decision makers in order to implement it and present this as a political alternative to their voters. I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion with the other presenters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riccardo, for this thorough and well-structured presentation of the policy brief. And yeah, of course, in 15 minutes, it's not easy to summarize it all. So now we will have more time to talk about it, and everyone will be able also to download it and read it with their time. And yeah, thanks. You were super punctual, exactly 15 minutes, so wow. And yeah, so now we will move to the panel discussion. The idea behind the panel discussion is to go deeper into the specific policies that are included in this more general framework of the Green New Deal beyond growth. And for this reason, we invited experts that have been working on the specific aspects of the policy package. For instance, universal basic services, public finance, and progressive taxation. And we do not have any speaker representing the Green Job Guarantee proposal that Riccardo just mentioned, but we have a whole policy brief about it on our website. written by Charles Stevenson, so we invite you to check it out. And yeah, before starting with the question, I present the speakers. We have Chiara Putaturo from Oxfam on progressive taxation. She's the Oxfam EU Deputy Head and Inequality and Tax Advisor. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Then we have Katie Wiese from the European Environmental Bureau. She's the Policy Manager for Economic Transition and Gender Equality. And Julian Siravo from the lead researcher of the Universal Basic Services Hub at the Autonomy Institute in the UK. Yes, thank you for being here with us. So now we will do the first round, the first question. Can you tell us if the Green New Deal Beyond Growth framework helps to connect your advocacy and demands to a more general, holistic, and global framework like the one that Riccardo just presented for societal change? Is this something that helps your fight? Does it connect to your work? Is it useful? And I would start with Chiara.
Yes, sure. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. So, for sure, this approach described in the policy brief supports our advocacy, our demands on progressive taxation at European level, both from the aspect of the picture of inequality that it gives, but also on the aspects of the recommendations. Concerning inequality, I think it gives a good picture on the inequality crisis and the needs for redistribution. When we talk about going beyond growth, it's important also to stress that we need also a redistribution of how of wealth, first of all, because wealth inequality is much higher than income inequalities. And the paper mentions some statistics. We have published just in October a report on the progressive taxation, the need to tax the high net worth individual in the EU, where we also show update figures on the wealth inequality in the European Union, and we found out that the wealth of the billionaire in the EU in just the first 6 months of 2025 increased by 400 billion, and compared to last year, we have almost 40 new billionaires in the EU. And if we look at the distribution of wealth, thanks for the data that the World Inequality Database produced, we see that the richest 0.001% of European, that is 3,600 Europeans, they own the same percentage, the same share of wealth that the poorest 50%, that counts 180 million people. So there is really a big divide there, and also connected to the picture that the author was giving between the public and the private. We also collected information on how basically the national wealth is distributed. We see in the last decades an increase of the national wealth, but this goes more and more in the hands of the private sector, while the public wealth has decreased compared to the private wealth. So there are different reasons beyond taxation, inequality, and Oxfam works on different causes of inequality, but taxation is one of that. It can be a cause also of inequality, while his mission should be actually to redistribute resources. And just two figures on that. so the economist Zuckman has shown how really the top 1% or even 0.1% pay an effective tax rate that is lower than the rest of the population. And this can be, I mean, you can check yourself we have data that prove it in several European countries. And if this is not more, another aspects of the inequality in the tax system comes out where we look at the tax revenue. So the 80% of the tax revenue in the EU comes from taxes that are generally paid or mainly paid by ordinary citizens, like for instance consumption taxes or labor taxes, while taxes that are paid by the wealthiest, for example a net wealth tax, contribute to the tax revenue far less. In the case of the wealth tax, it's just 0.4%. So the taxation has a role. And another important point that the briefing shows is also the connection between the wealth concentration and the environmental impact. We also published a report before the COP with also EU statistics showing that the richest 10% of Europeans create 28% of the EU emission, the same amount of the bottom 50%. And also the bottom half of Europeans is also the part of the population that has cut their emission the most, while the richest 1% has increased their emission in the last decades. So I think for all these aspects this briefing, this report is very useful, and also in terms of recommendation we are very much aligned. We also are asking to increase the taxation of the richest, both in terms of income and in terms of wealth, where beyond the net wealth tax, we're talking also about property, inheritance tax. And also one element that is important to make taxation of the high net worth individual easiest is the transparency of the asset, transparency also of how much taxes they pay. So I will stop here just to say that if there is the redistribution, I think there is also more public acceptance of other measures, like environmental measures that were mentioned before in the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Chiara. Yeah, so it seems like there is alignment between the work that Oxfam is doing and this political project. Is this the case also for the European Environmental Bureau or not? Like, what do you think, Katie? How does this complement?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And first of all, congratulations to the publication of the report. So I think from our perspective, the framework is valuable because it totally aligns also with our vision of what a more environmental and socially just economy could look like. And if you see some of our earlier publications, especially from the economic transition team, we have been criticizing also the European Green Deal for the same reasons than in the report. Although I have to say, considering the context now and what Emilie has said, I sometimes wish we would still have the European Green Deal, because what it looks now, it's being completely hollowed out, and there's not so much left what we have achieved in that regard. But focusing a little bit on the call for greater public financing for the transition, that's also something we fully support and we've been working on in the past. So for the last 4 or 5 years, together with other organizations, we have been working very closely on the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact, so the EU fiscal rules, which we have also seen as a big opportunity to enhance more fiscal space for the green transition. But the outcome was also quite disappointing. And there are also studies showing that under the current rules, only 3 member states are projected to meet their public investment needs. There's a NEF study. I can also paste it in the chat later. And the rest, they face actually quite high consolidation pressures. And I think this has already been seen in Belgium, but also in Germany. And even worse, at the same time, we see military spending exempted, while social environmental investments are being constrained. But I think this is also where the framework could be useful in the sense that it exposes also how the current macroeconomic structures prioritize GDP growth, or the military sector in that case, over other more essential sectors such as care, ecosystems, or also long-term resilience. What also supports our work is that the report echoes concerns that we had regarding private finance as the engine of the transition. And I think you mentioned public-private partnerships, but there are also many other examples showing that relying on private capital tends to produce high return investments in already profitable sectors and not low profitable sectors, and also essential sectors that we would need, such as care, for example. And for those interests, we're gonna have an event end of January. I can also post it in the chat on the strategy of de-risking and why this is concerning from different perspectives. And I think another interesting aspect of the report is the discussion around modern money theory and also sovereign currency capacity. I feel a little bit there's a growing recognition that governments are not households, and that they can also use or issue their own currency and also coordinate monetary and fiscal policy. So it's not completely in the margin anymore, but I welcome very much that this report also helps to debunk the myths that we still have around this. And I think, there's still more work needed. And the partners from the REAL project and also other organizations have also working on concrete recommendations. I think further discussions will be held. So I think the answer is yes, that it can strengthen our advocacy, but that we just have to keep in mind the current context that we're living in. So the rise of the far right, corporate capture, I mean, everything that Emilie says. And I think in our narrative, we really need to speak about what people care about. So they care about being secure, having a roof over their head, affordable food, etc. Because otherwise, I don't think we will advance on this agenda.
Thank you, Katie. I would ask Julian. Julian, you're in the UK, but do you think that this framework for a Green New Deal beyond growth for the EU also complements your work, and could it be also useful for you as a political project?
Absolutely. The answer from us is yes, and it really gives us. I'm going to go a little bit into why it gives us a really good language to speak about our work, especially. Just a few words on us. I come from the UBS Hub, which is part of the Autonomy Institute, and we draw from the Institute to fulfill all the functions we think this advocacy needs. So anything ranging from policy reports to quant research and podcasts, and we also congregate a network of organizations. I'd like to invite the panel to also join. So just to get back to the key question that you asked us, so we think that UBS is climate policy. We recently put out a report as part of the hub that points to the effects that climate shocks are already having on access to basics like food, in this case. And we also think UBS is climate policy because it addresses those issues in a really powerful and effective way, as is mentioned in the report, through large scale public procurement. So we think this is a really key element, and a proposal of ours I wanted to bring to the table, that could be interesting for the discussion later on, is the idea that we've been working on of using UK corner shops as the cornerstone of the distribution for a national food service. The idea is quite simple, that the state would bulk buy a core basket of goods, maintain low prices, as we've seen in some experiments across the world recently. The corner shops would receive a handling fee, which is a pretty standard practice now, that both the Royal Mail and services like Amazon use. And essentially, it would give access with no means testing. So pushing us in the direction of a truly destigmatized and universal service. This could also integrate packageless solutions quite easily with such a capillary network. So I guess what's important to us is that each one of these services is always framed as part of economic sustainability as much as a climate goal in itself. So that I'm going to stop there, also in the interest of time, and to leave space for the next questions. But thanks for having me.
Thank you, Julian. Really cool work. We are actually also starting to work on a policy brief on public supermarkets, so I think it's really related. Would be nice to have a UBS hub in EU countries as well. So before I pass to the next question, Riccardo, do you have any comment for the last interventions, or should I go to the last to the next question?
Yeah, I'm happy to leave the floor to the speakers to answer all their questions, and then I can share a few thoughts at the end.
Okay, perfectly. Then the next question is about the obstacles. Like it was already mentioned in the beginning, we have a deregulation wave. Besides this, capital is stronger than ever, and especially big tech. And so we were wondering if you see, from your perspective, from your specific work, if you see the Green New Deal Beyond Growth, a Beyond Growth project, as a feasible project, as a feasible political project. What are the obstacles, and how do you think we can get around them? I would ask first Kati. I think I'm pronouncing it wrong.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, yeah, the context is a bit depressing. I also feel like that our leaders they don't really have a vision, and are a bit out of ideas and relying on the same neoliberal toolbox from the 80s and 90s, which is also depressing if you're working actually for an organization who has a vision and as their alternatives. But yeah, from an advocacy strategies, I see two risks and two opportunities. One risk is that the far right also frames sometimes environmental and social investments as elite projects, so costly and disconnected from everyday realities. And I feel like policies that fail to address people's materials concerns are very vulnerable or unstable. And I think also in the EB, we had some reflections that in the past, environmental policies that didn't address the social justice aspect also didn't have the necessary support from the wider public. But I think that's also not only a narrative problem, as we already said, as economic drivers are important too. And what we see now, rising inequality, precarious jobs, and decreased public investment in essential services feed resentment, and this also creates fertile ground and for a further rise of the far right. And the second risk is that centrist governments often share a belief that markets will deliver, combined with the austerity or rigid fiscal rules. And this institutional conservatism is also really blocking more deeply structural transformation, and also reinforcing the perception that public power is dangerous or inefficient, or the government should step out. But there are also two opportunities, I believe. One is that people are not against transformation per se, but they're against unfair transformation. And I feel like when investment delivers cheaper public transport or accessible childcare, better jobs, local foods, I do think that support could increase. I think there are also a certain Eurobarometer surveys, plus that we have some positive communication examples from the left, such as Mamdani, which shows when policy connects to everyday realities, people respond with support or openness and not fear. And I think we should learn from this. And I think the second opportunity is that the status quo also has lost its credibility, because what we see now, I mean, privatization, austerity, and the reliance on private finance have also failed to deliver the resilience or security that people wish or seem to wish. And even some mainstream economists or trade unions or other partners have also recognized that public funds must play a central role in the transformation. And actually, when we think about the past mandate with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, we also saw a little bit a shift in actually providing more fiscal capacity. So I feel like if we have revenue from EU-owned resources, and there's also now the EU budget discussion, I mean, also to be seen what comes out of it. But this and reform fiscal rules and progressive taxation, I think, could also finance those services that we need, or housing renovations, public mobility networks, etc. So I think I think this where feasibility meets politics is, so to say, if we manage that public revenues are distributed fairly and purposefully. And then I feel like there's maybe also some room that the Green New Deal beyond growth is not only desirable, but also materially beneficial for the majority. And it's also been seen by the wider public. And I feel like this is one of the strongest defense that we have against the far right.
Thank you. Julian, Julian and then Chiara? Julian, do you have any comment on this?
I feel like I need to sort of bring testimony from the Wild West that the UK is that could be the most useful contribution. What we're up against in the UK is obviously the sort of growth first orthodoxies, that sort of PPP dependence that we see in the EU as well. I guess in a way, a lot of, especially the PPP element, is crumbling without credible alternatives, but it's still as far as the public is concerned, there is perhaps more skepticism these days. We have the real possibility of the far right actually coming to power in the UK, at least from where we stand now. And so as far as universal basic services is concerned, they'd obviously be championing the sort of welfare chauvinism that we've seen in other parts of Europe. And those are two issues sort of at a national level that we obviously encounter. I'm going to talk about two pilots very quickly that I think are interesting to talk about, and obviously the first issue there is how stretched, especially local authorities are to try things out. The first one is, in fact, the Camden Borough pilot. Camden is, to those who don't know, it's the richest council in the UK. They have £1 billion budget, which is not enough, but a lot comparatively. So this is a pilot that sort of bundled a few services together. They did digital connectivity, some access to food, and some public transportation, sort of mobility solutions. This was 16 families. It was a very sort of brief pilot. It was very limited. There were about, I think, about £30,000 injected into the whole thing. So that is it was certainly an interesting demonstration. We did a few interviews with the people who worked on it. It was a partnership between UCL and Camden Council, their Institute for Global Progress, who actually came up with the concept of universal basic services at the time. But definitely an interesting case in what can be organized, where there is the political will coming from, in this case, the design team over at Camden, who were sort of who made themselves very busy and made contact with UCL. The other interesting experiment that is taking place are public diners in Scotland. This is an idea that came out of a think tank called Nourish Scotland, who want to sort of resurrect the idea of British restaurants, they were called, during that sort of were started during World War II, but were eventually sort of completely shut down by the 70s. This is quite interesting because there is about, I think, about 1.5 million going into two pilots, and this is funded through UKRI, our research, our public research funder. So I guess, sorry, just to tie it together. The landscape for us has to really rely on very activist local authorities on very tight budgets, or very innovative and exciting ideas that can really present themselves as solutions to insecurity. Obviously, in this case, in a far more favorable political environment, which is that of Scotland. So in that sense, this is an example that has that the caveat of devolved powers there. So I hope these can also prove useful in the discussion later. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. It's for sure useful to know about these pilots. And yes, I would pass the word to Chiara and ask you, if you can go, Julian, back to the slide of the question.
Yes, on the feasibility, in the current context. So I will maybe focus more on the feasibility, on the progressive taxation. What are the obstacles and what are the way we try to tackle them? So I would mention maybe 3 main obstacles and critiques that we receive. So the first one is about when we talk about taxation, the risk that we want to tax more the middle class or also the poorest. So there, it's really important to be clear that the kind of taxes we are talking about are taxes that really target the richest. And I mean, there are ways to do it, and we are not talking about, for instance, the carbon taxes that, as mentioned in the report, finally have hit the most vulnerable the most. Second, another argument that especially the right raises that the rich actually deserve this fortune. Why we want to tax it, and it's also a useful fortune to create investment, create growth. So we can see that actually a lot of this wealth is just inheritance wealth, and also it doesn't produce productive. It doesn't bring productive investment, but it's just parked there to produce new wealth. It's just used also as a speculation. And then even if there are cases when this wealth is deserved, is used also for investment, but we have also to ask ourselves, isn't that dangerous that there are people that are so rich that they can influence the democracy more than our votes? So this wealth inequality could be a problem per se, beyond the economic implication, growth on investment. And then a third point is maybe a bit more technical, and it relates to the risk that the rich individual and investors will leave the countries if we tax them more. But first of all, there are a lot of studies, and I invite you also to read a paper that Zuckman published just last week on the EU and the feasibility of a wealth tax. There are a lot of studies that show that this is not the reality. It's not true that in past experience of wealth taxation that rich individuals were leaving the countries. And also today we have much more advanced transparency to track the wealth, and also measures to can be a bit technical, but they are called exit tax measures to continue to tax the rich individual even if they leave the country. So this is a bit a disincentive for them. And then an important point to make is that this also the state needs this money through the tax revenue. If we have less revenues, the ordinary citizens have to pay more in terms of taxes on consumption of labors, but also there would be cut in public services and austerity policy. So we need this money for public investment. Maybe just a last remark, maybe one of the argument that is a bit more difficult maybe to sell is one of the last argument of the paper that is a bit the neo-monetary policy. So the fact that actually we don't need taxation to finance public services, but taxation is an instrument more to balance inflation. That is true from the economic point of view. This is true, but maybe it's a bit more difficult to explain it also to citizens how it works. Also because one of the argument that we use to justify taxation for the need of taxation is that it is useful to finance the public services. So maybe that argument I would use a bit less for our advocacy campaign.
Thank you, Chiara, and thank you all. Then I ask a quick final question. Then and then we go to the Q&A, and we also ask Riccardo to like comment on these comments. So a quick last question would be, in the audience here we have a lot of people who will be leading the future transition to a beyond growth society, or however we want to call it, but they will be there. We have people from the youth league of the Green Europeans, and we have people that are active in so many ways, and people who are in NGOs and institutions and students. And so we would like you to tell them from your perspective how to get engaged in a political project such as this one, to focus a bit on the what is to be done question. What are the next steps that NGO workers, youth league party members, activists, practitioners should take in order to make this a beyond growth approach take a center stage in national and international politics? I say quick question, it sounds like a very long question actually, but yeah. If you this time we can start with Chiara.
Yes, sure. So I would say, I mean, first of all, try to fight this competition and growth mantra that has been dominant in the last year, and I show that there is an alternative. And in particular, I mean, on taxation, challenge all the government's arguments that say that there is no money, so we need to cut in public services. This is simply not true, and it's not true both because, I mean, as the policy brief shows, so we are not households, so we can print money if we want. We can increase the investment, but also, I mean, there are revenues out there, and these revenues can be taken by the regions that are not taxed enough. So my suggestion would be really to look also at your countries, to look at how in the field of taxation, how taxes are distributed, get informed about that. A lot of time it's not so much a technical debate, but it's really a political debate. It is important that ordinary citizens are engaged in it. So try to look at the distribution of the wealth and of taxes in your countries. Ask for transparency on that. I mean, a simple thing would be, for example, to have in every country information on how the 0.1% reaches 1% pay in taxes, something that we don't have for every country. And then let's also not forget a global point of view. There is currently a good opportunity, an historical opportunity at the UN, where countries are negotiating a new tax convention on taxation that will include also a fair taxation of corporation, but also of the rich individuals. So it's important that every country is engaged in that, and that doesn't water down the final proposals. So I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Katie?
Yes, I mean, I echo also lots of things that Chiara said. And I think from our experience at the EB, 3 points. One is to build broad and diverse coalitions. So I think it's really important that NGOs connect with each other, trade unions, youth movements, local municipalities, but also progressive businesses, as change often does not happen in silos. And I think there have been also quite successful collaboration with Fridays for Future and transport drivers or public transport drivers, for example, in Germany. And the second one is what I mentioned before, that it's important to focus on what materially matters to people, so that we manage to communicate policies in a way that resonates with the life of people. And in that sense, I think the narrative is important, but it should also be backed with concrete practical proposals. And I think that's was also nice that Julian was here, because he also mentioned some very local or practical examples. And I think we should also really continue to share this. And I would or would like to ask you to engage in fiscal and monetary debates. I think sometimes these are very technical. And also when I engaged 5 years in the EU fiscal rules, it took me some time to get into the topic. But rules like the Stability and Growth Pact and also EU budget constraints and really shape what governments can do. And in the end, it impacts every one of us. And I think that's why it's really important that we advocate for public finance for the transition, we debunk certain myths, and we also make more accessible what is actually happening in the fiscal and monetary space. And there are also great examples like Fiscal Future in Germany, who also, as it's a youth organization, and they also, for example, try to do this. I think this is probably how you can then shift the Overton window and make more systemic change feasible. And one last thing is probably also that we need to be patient and consistent as change. I think, as I said before, sometimes really takes a long time, but also in the past, if we constantly challenge our policymakers or other institutional actors, I think it's important to keep the agendas on the horizon and to challenge what they're doing.
Thank you. Julian, do you have a quick last comment on this?
I'll be very quick. Just 3 brief invitations to the audience, depending on sort of what you guys do. One is to choose a service and politicize it. I think we saw it really work well with the Mamdani campaign, particularly around buses. Also the supermarkets. I think even had they gone just for buses, it could have worked. But this is also something for campaigners. And to sort of tie it into these wider visions, which my 3rd point, data really works, is something that we find, as in when we attach attention-grabbing facts, data, shocking numbers to the proposals that we make. If you are in an organization that is in the business of getting the attention of media, that is something that, whether you're a campaign group, whether you're a think tank, it's important to have numbers that people care about, basically. Where possible, we can put these tools in communities' hands. This is something that we've seen in other areas of autonomy's work. It's really empowered certain marginalized groups in ways that have been surprising even to us. Then finally, there's a bit more fine point, piecemeal but modular. And the idea that every expansion, every redesign of services in our case, but other parts of government policy necessarily will have to be bit by bit, and we need to make sure that those changes are prefigurative of this wider system. We need to be applying consistent principles when we get into this work, and maybe this is also a call to agree on those principles. I would start with universal, regenerative, and freedom expanding. And I just wanted to pick up something that our colleague brought up earlier, which is whether it's a non-reformist reform in the sort of Gorzian language because I think that's something to really put at the center of what will necessarily be a very chaotic and piecemeal process. So thanks. I'm just
Thank you, Julian. Amazing. So now we go into the Q&A section. I would start with the first question to connect a bit. A question that I already see that it's being asked in the Mentimeter, and also something that has been brought up by by the speakers while talking about the obstacles, which is the question of how to pay, and the whole MMT question, the fact that this needs to be clear, and that this might be a weak point of an economic policy that goes beyond growth independence. So I would directly go and ask Riccardo, how would you apply MMT in Europe, given that the European Central Bank is supranational, it is shielded from political influence, outside the control of national government, in general, also more in general than this question, what do you think about the comments that the speakers have presented about the obstacles with the public finance?
All right. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I agree that this is a sticking point, and indeed it's the most difficult, let's say, to communicate clearly to a wider public. And I understand we should not get bogged down into, let's say, these technicalities. And indeed, I see MMT rater, let's say, as an enabler, to bring about a wider conversation about the way the economy works and the way in which money should be treated as a public good. And of course, there are several groups that have been campaigning on this at the European level. So I think that some groundwork has already been laid, and we could build on that. So just jumping quickly on the question that was asked from the audience. Well, I do think that the European Central Bank currently faces some constraints in applying a full-fledged MMT policy, but I would add that that's because the European Central Bank has been designed that way. So it's not, let's say, an external factor that prevents European Central Bank from acting, let's say, as an actual lender of last resort, but rather it's the way it's been built. So since it's been built this way out of political will, we could reform it, but without necessarily waiting for a full treaty reform. I think that during the COVID pandemic, we saw the European Central Bank acting quite remarkably, similarly to, for example, the Fed or other central banks that, let's say, have fewer neoliberal constraints. And simply this was done by circumventing some rules. So essentially guarantee the public debt of certain national governments, of certain member states. And I'm from Italy, and when you look at the numbers regarding the way in which the Italian government essentially managed to maintain its public spending in the context of a very dramatic contraction in economic activity, you see that is basically being done through a guarantee on the increase of the public debt. So essentially a guaranteed deficit spending the European Central Bank enacted. So I think we should fight for a reform of the European Central Bank, and in the meantime, we can expect that by putting enough political pressure on decision makers, we could, in a way, tinker around the edges and make the European Central Bank acting in more progressive ways, simply by putting the political will that is necessary to do that. I think that what happened during the pandemic is a precedent, and it should not be ignored. So if it was done back then, there is no reason why it could not be done now. I'll leave it at that.
Does anyone, maybe especially Katie or Chiara, want to comment on this? What do you think about this response about monetary policy in a growth independent scenario? Is this satisfying, a bit more satisfying to you? What are your doubts?
I mean, I'm also not an expert in MMT, but I know that there are research like Dirk Ehns who have engaged quite a lot on MMT in Europe, and then it's also possible in different ways. And that I think Riccardo also mentioned in the beginning, I mean, with quantitative easing, it's also some form of MMT that's already been practiced. What I think someone was raised in another discussion is, but for example, is MMT desirable if we have a right-wing government or only right-wing governments in Europe? And that's why I think it's also important and interesting, and some organizations are also doing it, in thinking about, okay, how can we democratize also those? Yeah, and then the last thing is, of course, so that there's also still some wiggle room when it comes to fiscal and monetary coordination, and this could, for example, also be strengthened. But Chiara, maybe you have other other thoughts.
Yeah, no, on my side, I'm also not an expert on that, but I mean, I agree that we can go through step, and probably, I mean, thinking about this big role of European Central Bank requires time. I mean, I do think that. I mean, it's true from the economic point of view. Still, it can be a bit difficult to convey. So, still to continue also to stress the fact that we need, I mean, progressive taxation also to raise revenue, especially in the, I mean, short, medium term, because we are seeing what is the debate at European level that we have to invest in defense, and so we have to cut on other things. I would say probably the shorter answer would say no. There are, I mean, taxes we can raise. We don't need to cut on those services.
Thank you. I would go to another question. I don't know if Riccardo, you have a quick and I follow up on it. No, I go.
No.
What should be our political strategy to achieve these policy demands? How do we move from the shopping list of progressive policy to actually building power and building public support for change? I think before Julian had some good points on this with his pilots, and there was a suggestion of focusing on one need and then building a campaign around that specific need, like Mamdani did in New York. Yeah, I open the floor, whoever wants to take it.
I mean, if I may, I think this is also a bit of reflection that we are having in Oxfam. We need to rebuild or to strengthen the link with citizens, with the constituencies, because I mean, one of the weakness maybe in the last year was that. As Katie also was saying, that our policies are a bit policies for the rich people, but we have really to show that what we are proposing is in the interest of ordinary people, also the most vulnerable, and we have to try to rebuild a bit the link with them. Also, trying to reflect what are I mean their needs and what are their worries. So try really to speak more with the population, more with the ordinary citizens. Also, sometimes maybe investing more in campaign activities. I'm talking, I mean, from the perspective of an organization that is reflecting about that. So not just advocacy, but let's try to also have more activities on the ground and more campaign activities.
I guess this is I've been having a lot of discussion with students about sort of who is the subject of these political changes, who are we championing really with these policies, and something that we think about a lot is the aging population itself, and organizing a lot of ideas is especially about the public services that we discussed, but also the cost of living crisis and the housing crisis, to frame them either about the people who are aging now or the people who are worried about taking care about their aging parents. This is a slightly lateral comment to this, but it is something that I'd be interested in discussing as a more explicit political agenda, as a more explicit political strategy to get to the heart of everything that Riccardo's report is discussing.
Thank you, Julian. So it's 6:30, 6:31. People are leaving. We're supposed to end. So yeah, thank you all. I don't know if Riccardo, you have one final remark about this whole discussion, something that you wanna like you feel like the policy brief, that could a comment about the discussion, how it what it tells about the policy brief and the current political situation. Otherwise, we can directly
Yeah,
close.
just quickly, I mean, I'm very pleased with the warm reception that was given by all of you. So thank you very much. And indeed, the ambition of this policy brief is merely to, let's say, act a bit as an overarching framework to articulate the various campaigns and proposals that you have been leading on. And indeed, our work as academics is simply, I think, to kind of step out, let's say, from the ongoing public and political debate and just trying to, let's say, analyze it in a way that can be at the service, of course, of the campaigns that you are leading. So I hope that the work that we do related to post growth and the growth can be useful to you, and I very much salute, let's say, the approach with which you have been, let's say, choosing certain services and politicize them, as Julian rightly said, because I do believe that the proposals we are putting forward are speaking to are materially, let's say, beneficial to most people. They are not merely a moral discourse, but rather they speak to the also self-interest of most of the voters. So I think there are all the bases to try and win support of course, at the ground level, and also to try and push political parties to adopt some of these policies. As I said, that was the original ambition of the policy brief. In partly succeeded, in part it did not. So I hope it can still be relevant now for the ongoing, let's say, political debates at the EU level, and trying to focus on the local, national, and European elections to come, and trying to, let's say, speak with one voice for the many campaigns that yes, bring us together, and trying to see post growth as not something alchemic and like far removed from the most pressing political debates and people's needs, but rather as something that can help us advance in that direction. So thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Riccardo. Really, thank you for these final words. And yeah, thanks to everyone, especially to the speakers for joining, to Julian, to Katie, to Chiara, to Riccardo. Amazing. Thanks for coming. And
thank you.
Well, thank you, Federico, for organizing it and all the work you put into it.
Thank you. And also to Emilie from the European Environmental Bureau and from the European Environmental Bureau in general for supporting this and for co-hosting it. And to the whole Research and Degrowth of Policy Brief team. We have here Milena, who was in the technicalities, and Lorenzo, Anna, and Ugo, who are also part of the team. Yes, thank you, and thanks to the participants for joining. You can find the policy brief on our website. We have a press release if you want to help us share it around. And yes, let's stay in touch, and we will send an email with follow-ups tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.